You got to develop these players. You can't just say, okay, this guy's good, this guy's bad on draft night. No, it is a process. That's the real process, not the nonsense that everybody talks about. And that's where Nick Sirianni is going to make his bones in this league, because that's what the Eagles are telling us behind the scenes. This is a teaching coaching staff. So let's see if they can develop.
Teams. I want to ask you about guys in charge of football teams. Coach Doug Peterson. That way we'll get both in. We won't disrespect anybody. We'll call him Coach Doug Peterson. During his tenure here in Philadelphia, one of the knocks, and yes, we know Doug brought home the trophy, which now adorns the outside of the link. So he is never going to be thought of as anything without that being part of the equation. It has to be part of the equation. But we look at both the good and the bad, and yes, he is no longer the coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. One of the reasons is because during his tenure, there wasn't a great track record of player development. There weren't guys who were taken at a specific spot in the draft who then went out and overachieved. Who you thought they were going to be player A, they were player A plus. More often than not, if they were player A, they ended up being player C or C minus or D, or there are a couple Fs thrown in there that before you knew it, they were ex-Philadelphia Eagles. Player development is a big part of the game, probably a part that we underemphasize as members of the media. Let's compare the new coaching staff to the old coaching staff. What does the new coaching staff have to do to be better in player development than it was here during the Doug Peterson era?
Well, the short answer is they have to develop players, but long answer is this is one of the reasons we are in the position we're in, and why Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman, more so Jeffrey Lurie, made the coaching change. And by the way, I think it's a fair criticism to look at the past couple seasons, the final couple seasons of the Doug Peterson era, and say, yeah, guys didn't develop the way they should have developed. So I do think that is a fair criticism. There's many parts to it, obviously. We've talked about the time restrictions, the practice restrictions. It's a little bit different than it used to be. The Eagles claim this is a great teaching coaching staff. So we're going to see. I mean, this is how I'm going to grade this coaching staff more than results. How are young players developing? Jalen Reagor's a perfect example of this. Jody, I've said this to you a number of times. A lot of fans, a lot of media people, to be honest, they think it ends with the draft. You either get a good player or you get a bad player. And everything's in a vacuum. Justin Jefferson is great, and Minnesota's going to be great here. Jalen Reagor was bad here. He would have been great in Minnesota because Justin Jefferson was great. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. All situations are different. I always go back to Donovan McNabb in 1999 because he was lucky enough to be tethered to Andy Reid, who was one of the great coaching quarterback developers, certainly of this generation, maybe arguably the best. You know, who knows? Go back to that draft. There were so many quarterbacks, so many talented quarterbacks at the top of the draft. If one of them got tethered to Andy Reid instead of the situations they were in, and vice versa, Donovan McNabb had to go to Cleveland or one of these bad organizations, what would happen to Donovan McNabb? It's not a vacuum. You have to develop these players. And we go back to the NBA championship. We go back to the Sixers, the Milwaukee Bucks, the first time since Kareem, what was named Lou Alcindor, Jody. And you're probably one of the only people that are going to get that name, Lou Alcindor, at this point of time. And Bob Dangerous and Oscar Robertson. That's how long you got to go back for the Milwaukee Bucks to win an NBA championship. Giannis was the 15th pick in the draft. We talked about the process and you got to have the first round pick. You got to have the number one pick. You can't do it any other way in the NBA. Chris Middleton was a second round pick, I believe, Jody. Drew Holiday was here. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't good enough for these people. You know, but you get Michael Carter Williams. That's where it all started. Drew Holiday. You get Michael Carter Williams. You get Nerlens Noel. And I felt like that organization at that time said, "Oh, we got good players. That's it." Nope. Got to develop those good players. And they got to get better and better and better. Same thing in football. You got to develop these players. You got to develop these players. You can't just say, okay, this guy's good, this guy's bad on draft night. No, it is a process. That's the real process, not the nonsense that everybody talks about. And that's where Nick Sirianni's going to make his bones in this league, because that's what the Eagles are telling us behind the scenes. This is a teaching coaching staff. So let's see if they can develop. We're talking about cornerbacks. One of the great things I think Jeffrey Knox said was, let's talk about these young players. They got to develop some of these young players. Go get Steven Nelson if you want, but you still got to develop some of these young players.
The scary thing that you said, you and I see this one in lockstep. You and I are on the same exact page with comparisons between other sports and the like, and what the Bucs just did and what you expect teams to do. Player development is underrated, underanalyzed by members of the media, that they bring players along, they elevate players by putting them in the right system, by coaching them up. The problem is that now in the National Football League, the amount of time that you actually have to coach the players is so legislated in comparison to what it used to be. I have a tough time being as critical as I once was. That, oh my God, how did you not get this young man coming out of college with the talent level that he showed? How did he only come into the league and be okay? How was he not an above average player? How did he not develop into a star? I used to be very comfortable in saying things like that. Now, with the fact that every time they have a collective bargaining agreement, and thank God we won't have to face it for 10 more years, the owners say, we'll keep the money, but here's what we'll give you: less work. You get to show up less often. We'll have less practice time. We'll have less physicality while we're at practice. They make the coach's job harder on a year in, year out basis with the collective bargaining agreement. So unless you're a miracle worker and or you are a mind melder that you can get inside the head of kids, they just don't have the wherewithal to coach them up and to make them better players and to develop them. So I don't know what the answer is as to, and I like Nick Sirianni. I've been motivated by Nick Sirianni. He's put a smile on my face. I don't know if he can coach a little bit, but the only things we've had to judge him on so far, what he's had to say, you got a little grass time, so you saw him a little bit in action, but some of the drills that they're doing are actually humorous. They're not really drills. They're camaraderie drills more than anything else. I don't know whether he can coach or not, and I have a hard time coming down on him and saying, how did he not improve this guy when he doesn't really have the chance to improve the guy because of the collective bargaining agreement rules?
Well, I agree with you. Well, a couple of things. I don't think anybody's coming down hard on him. I mean, that's what he was sold as, sort of behind the scenes for the Eagles. We haven't seen it yet, so we'll have to see how he develops some of the younger players, especially some of the players that haven't hit the ground as quickly as maybe some people assume they would. You're right about the CBA, but the sliding scale with that, Jody, is everybody's under the same restrictions. So it's the same sort of, it's grading on a curve.
That's true.
You don't have the same opportunity, but you have the same opportunity as everybody else. You're under the same restrictions. Now, Urban Meyer's already complaining about those restrictions. That's the point. You got to adjust. You got to adapt. You got to figure out a way to at least do it a little bit better than everybody else. And that's when you become a top tier, coach, top tier developer of talent, however you want to describe it. And, I don't need Nick Sirianni to be Bill Walsh. I need him to be good under the restrictions he faces. And that's what will be ultimately graded on. And I think that's fair. So when you look at some of these disappointing young players, and I put that term in quotes because Look, Jalen Rager's the most obvious because he was the first round pick last year and disappointed everyone. I think part of that had to do with injuries, to be honest. Wasn't healthy. So, right off the bat, if he stays healthy, I think he's going to be a better player. But clearly, he needed some help also when it comes to the technique, the route running, things of that nature. Then we go back the year prior. You can really see it with J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, who hasn't developed. These are the type of players, especially because he's got wide receiver in his background. He was a wide receiver in college. He coached the position. We got to see some improvement. We talked about corners. Everybody's, Steven Nelson is a Band-Aid. If you get him, great. He's a Band-Aid. You got to develop Avonte Maddox better to where at least he can be a really good slot cornerback. You got to develop some of these guys, whether it's Mike Jaquette or Zach McPherson. And that's what Jonathan Gannon is supposed to be. So this is the task placed in front of them, and this is where they have to succeed, Jody.
Yes, and you mentioned two of the wide receivers. I go back and add Nelson Aguilar to that mix. As soon as he got out of town, he got to become a better and more productive wide receiver with the Raiders. Maybe that had something to do with Derek Carr. I don't know, but I don't know if it was John Gruden's coaching. They developed him. They got him to up his game production-wise more so than he ever did here in Philadelphia. So wide receiver is a key position, and the point you make about this being a kind of wide receiver-based coaching staff, that's where Sirianni cut his teeth. Well, I hope that pays dividends. I hope that is the case, that the Eagles are actually better at wide receiver. Cornerback is another position. And the other one I'd add to the mix where they came up short, and maybe we'll actually see an improvement with this new football team, new coaching staff, is defensive end. The fact that, for me, Barnett has not lived up to his draft status his whole time here in Philadelphia. Just a couple of years ago, they used a middling draft pick on Sharif Miller. He's gone. A year and change later, he's gone. The previous Eagle coaching staff didn't do good enough job at developing pass rushers. Give me an optimistic slant as to why we should think the new Philadelphia Eagle coaching staff, at least this team this upcoming year, should be better at getting to the quarterback.
Well, number one, I would say that wasn't a deficiency of the team overall. I think they were, near the top of the league when it comes to pass rushing and pass rushing efficiency, number one. So that's a strength. But that has to do with veteran players, mainly Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham and so on. I think you're a little hard on Derek Barnett, as I've said in the past. When he's healthy, and he can't stay on the field. The issue with Derek, and I've mentioned this before, if he's a second-round pick, he's great. He's a first-round pick, so he's not great, which is, part of the gig. I mean, that's what it is. You face the pressure. I talk about the Giants this year where they drafted, I think, Kadarius Toney in the first round, and it was Azeez Ojulari in the second round. Right. I think Ojulari is going to be the better player. I think if they draft Ojulari in the first round, Toney in the second round, you make things easier on Toney. Now he's up against it because he doesn't belong where he was drafted, and people are going to always expect what he's going to be. So it's kind of weird, Derek Barnett, but I think he's a solid player. Don't think he's a great player. I think he's a solid player. Josh Sweat has developed a little bit. We'll see with Milton Williams inside. He's going to be supposedly a versatile player, mainly play inside, but can play outside because he's so athletic. They've always gotten to the quarterback. The problem has been the back end. And it's one of those things where, and I think Jeffrey Knox said this as well, those two parts of the game are always meshed together. You either get to the quarterback quickly to help out your corners, or vice versa. You have good corners who can help you cover a little bit longer, can help you get to the corner. There's no question with the Philadelphia Eagles, as they are structured right now, Jody, yeah, it's the pass rush. They got to get home to mask the deficiencies of the back end, where they got to get a little bit closer to get that back end up to speed. That defensive line is still good, and I think it's still top 10 in the NFL.
And they will play it a little bit differently. I know you are a big Jim Schwartz fan. and we kind of disagree on Derek Barnett, and we kind of disagree on Jim Schwartz. I think he was a good, solid defense coordinator. I don't think he was ever a special or game-changing defensive coordinator. Do you think this defense is going to be more aggressive, less aggressive, differently aggressive? How do you think we're going to look at last year, well, more than last year, the entire Doug Peterson era, led by Jim Schwartz? How are we going to look at them in the way they went about playing defense as compared to the way this upcoming year's team, Eagle defense, is going to be situated?
Well, if I had to guess, I would say short term for this season, they're going to be less aggressive. And I think for obvious reasons, I think they're going to play a lot of cover 2, cover 3 to protect the cornerbacks, number one. So they're going to play a lot of zone. And if you look at where Jonathan Gannon comes from and Mike Zimmer, and I know Mike pretty well, he really stresses. He's a Bill Parcells guy. He really stresses a disciplined pass rush. And in other words, I always talk about sacks not being that important. He's in that camp. He wants a disciplined pass rush. In other words, he doesn't want Jason Babbitt freelancing guys going all over just to get a sack. He wants to make sure you're in your gap, your lane at all time, pushing the pocket, not only pushing the pocket, but making sure the quarterback can't escape. So I think they're going to be more disciplined, a little less aggressive. Eagles fans are probably not going to like that. And then as the talent changes, I think, if you get corners, you can be more aggressive. And then if you get linebackers, you can blitz from the A gaps. You get more aggressive. But I don't think the Eagles have that talent right now. So I think they're going to be less aggressive.
We'll see how the quote-unquote blitzing goes with this team. And there are some guys that are just expected to get home, get sacks, make big plays. And yeah, Derek Barnett's 19 and a half sacks in 4 years in the National Football League.
Let me ask you this, Jody. Would you agree? Now, as I said, that's part of the gig. If you're a first-round pick, would you agree if he's a second-round pick, you wouldn't have as much issues with him?
Oh, as much? No. Issues maybe, but not as much. That's what it's all about, John. It's living up to expectations.
I understand
and
that.
The expectations are affixed to you as soon as they call your name out on draft night.
I understand
as you get paid in a capped league, which the NFL is, and with that rookie contract, you are slotted in. There's very little wiggle room. You and I have been going back and forth about Landon Dickerson and offset money, which has held up the fact that he hasn't signed yet. But we know what the money's going to be. There's very little movement. The NFL, that's another thing that the Players Association has given away in their last collective bargaining agreements. Yeah, just go ahead and slot the whole draft, specifically with first-round draft picks. Ahead of time what you're going to make. In that sort of a world, yes, expectations are tethered to where you are drafted. But you're paid by where you are drafted.
My only point, Jody, is I agree with you. Expectations are part of it. I'm just saying he's not a bad player. He didn't live up to expectations. That part I agree with. But he's not a bad player. And I think because he's a first-round pick, people say, Derek Barnett. No, he's actually a pretty competent, pretty effective player when he's out there. That's my only point. Has he lived up to expectations? No. But you can win with Derek Barnett. You want more out of a 14th overall pick, but because they have Brandon Graham and have had Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox, when he's out there, he's pretty successful. And the defensive line was the strength of this team throughout Jim Schwartz's entire era and will continue to be in Jonathan Gannon's first year. It's their best group from a talent standpoint.
I think their offensive line is their best group from a
I mean, on defense. On defense.
On defense. Well, yeah. So they're better than the linebackers and the safeties and the cornerbacks?
We're talking about defense.
Is that the tallest midget in the circus thing here?
It is, because the back seven is awful on paper, which is where the development comes in. You got to start developing some of these players. Nobody talks about Davion Taylor anymore because he was non-existent. I mean, he's a third-round pick. Something's got to give. Or you say he either develops or you got to admit the mistake. He's got to get on the field. He's the most talented linebacker by far from a physical perspective this team has. And I mean by leaps and bounds. So if you're going to draft him, Howie Roseman, you got to find coaches who can develop him. Simple as that.
That's one way to make the argument for Derek Barnett. He's certainly given you more than Davion Taylor has. I know it's not a perfect comparison. One's in his fifth year, the other's in the second year. But even his first year, actually, I think Derek Barnett's first year might have been his best year. He came in and actually contributed year number one. Some of the draft picks from last year's class, not so much. He is John McMullen. I am Jody McDonald. We are Birds 365. Take a time out, come back. We got a couple more issues we want to get it into before we put a wrap on Birds 365.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.